It sure feels good to be back. And for those curious where I was and who don't follow me on the TikTok and the Instagram, the Hubs and I spent 3 days in Madrid and Toledo, Spain, before embarking on our dream week-long trip to Ghana, where we both have ancestral origins, as many people with Jamaican and Guyanese backgrounds do. Fun fact, so many Jamaicans were actually Ghanaians before slavery. Jamaican citizens can actually travel to Ghana without obtaining a visa. We both needed them, however. One of the interesting things about heading to Europe and Africa back-to-back is that it really brought home what friend of the show Robert Robbie Jones wrote in his book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, which we discussed on this show last week. And that is just how central the Christian churches, the Catholics, Presbyterians, and Anglicans, etc., were in the grisly enterprise of the Atlantic slave trade. Many of those gorgeous churches in Europe were built in the 15th century during the vaunted Age of Exploration, when Christopher Columbus and other European explorers were sanctioned and funded by European kings like Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella to get out there and find gold, to finance and gild those massive churches and build the fortunes and castles of the monarchs, and also the slave castles in places like Elmina and Cape Coast in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, also built in the 15th century. And as for any indigenous people the explorers encountered, the so-called Indians in the Americas, or Black Africans, all the explorers had to do, per the Catholic Church's doctrine of discovery, was attempt to convert them to Christianity. And if they resisted in any way, the explorers had the permission of God himself to conquer them, kill them, enslave them for life, and most importantly, to dispossess them of their lands, with or without a treaty. Conquerors enslaved large groups of the newly encountered peoples in the Americas, working many of them to death. And then a Spanish clergyman who noted the high death rates from European illnesses among the indigenous slaves in the Americas suggested using Africans instead. And the arms race was on between the European kingdoms to set up slave trade bases in Africa and buy prisoners of tribal wars or use slave catchers to kidnap as many people as possible. Europeans literally fought many wars with each other to hold on to these slave castles, to ply their grisly trade. They protected them with literal armies and cannons. That is how valuable the slave trade was. One of the wildest facts about those slave castles in Cape Coast and Elmina was that churches were literally, deliberately built directly on top of the dungeons where the captured Africans were kept, so that the godly governors running the place and their soldiers could contemplate the Almighty, while literally below their feet, men and women packed into the crowded, pitch-dark cells were loudly suffering and often dying, having to eat, sleep, defecate, urinate, and everything else on the same dank floors. And any who didn't go blind or die were forced at gunpoint through the door of no return and onto slave ships bound for the New World, never to be heard from again. Those who did die in the slave dungeons did not receive Christian burials, despite the churches overhead. Their bodies were pitched into the sea. Millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic as human property. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced human migration in world history. Millions never survived the infamous Middle Passage across the Atlantic, their souls lying beneath the sea between Africa and the Americas. And these right-wingers act all shocked that there would be black mermaids. Among those who did survive was my own maternal ancestor, a Fulani Muslim woman named Ihaba Wabusia, later a converted Christian, renamed Michie Johnson. She was born in 1800 in Ghana, and as a 6 or 7-year-old was incarcerated in one of those slave castles in Ghana and shipped to present-day Guyana with her mom. She actually lived to be 106 years old. She died in 1906, 23 years before my own mother was born. This stuff is not ancient history, y'all. And history is fascinating, right? Americans should consider making it legal to teach in schools here. And the last thing I will add is that when you look at the sometimes violent history of organized religion, from the slave trade to the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Salem witch trials, to the religion-based conflicts and conquest in places like Israel, Palestine, or the emergence, again, per Robbie Jones, of right-wing Christianity-based white supremacy here in the U.S., it should not surprise you that the base of support for far-right policies on banning books and distorting history, on abortion, on LGBTQ issues, even support for cults like QAnon and the cult of personality around Donald Trump, are grounded in religious extremism. I'm not saying religion is always bad. Sometimes it does beautiful things. But organized religion has, shall we say, a colorfully mixed history. And right now in this country, religious extremism mixed with white nationalism and that Trump cult of personality are straining our society and our democracy to the breaking point. And the question is, what do we do about it? Frank Schaeffer, whose very own father once galvanized the religious right, joins me next to try to help us get to an answer. Stay with us.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
Over the past couple of years, we've seen the Republican Party, both subtly and not so subtly, embrace openly the idea of Christian nationalism. But it's important to note that while they claim to use Christian values to justify their extremist policies, almost none of what they stand for is actually based on the teachings of the impoverished Jewish guy from Palestine who was killed by the Romans in 1 BC and who preached to care for the poor, the sick, and immigrants, to not pray in public and to love your neighbor as yourself. You know, the guy these people claim to believe in. Take Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon-curious Georgia congresswoman who yesterday, on the anniversary of 9/11, tweeted, and I quote, "States should consider seceding if the president doesn't change his policies at the southern border. Please. Nobody tell her Jesus was a refugee. She might try to deport him." Joining me now is Frank Schaeffer, film director, screenwriter, and author of the book Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. Frank, thank you so much for being here. I will just allow you to comment, if you would, on a member of Congress saying that we should secede. I guess maybe not her state because it's kind of a blue state now. We should secede from the union if immigrants are not mistreated. That's not real biblical. I don't think.
Yeah, Joy, let me say, the introduction you gave with your trip to Ghana and the slave trade is really, sadly, the perfect background to address this subject. This week in Washington, there's a group meeting of Christian leaders, Pray, Vote, Stand, at which Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump, DeSantis, and the rest of the crew will all speak. And this same group is very much allied these days with Viktor Orban of Hungary, who has established a kind of Christian nationalism, white nationalism there. You know, when Eichmann, who was the designer of the Holocaust with Himmler, came to Hungary with only 20 officers after Hungary fell to the Germans, he said, you know, we don't need to bring more troops here because the Roman Catholic Church is already doing such a good job rounding the Jews up, suppressing them. They will do our work for us. And indeed, they did. That ties in so beautifully with that amazing oratory that you just gave us on your trip to Ghana.
Thank you.
Where there are churches sitting in a building with prisoners, slaves, enslaved people languishing beneath. This is not new. What your listeners, what your viewers have to understand is that white nationalism and Christian nationalism have marched hand in hand since the 14th century into our world, and they have never stopped. There are interregnums where there are pauses, but the American Christian nationalists, the white nationalists, this amalgam of people who are now trying to stop the teaching of Black history, roll back rights for women and gay folks, who are trying to put us back in a position of ignoring our own racist history as if we can blot it out, are very much in line with the history of Christian conquest. They are not the anomaly, they are the norm. What is the anomaly is the wonderful breathing space we were given by the civil rights movement. What is the anomaly is this idea that somehow equality and freedom should coexist. You know, we're the only country on earth right now that has even attempted a truly multiracial, multicultural society built on our broken history of slavery that we have tried to move beyond. And now these people, the Republican Party, this week, Pray, Vote, Stand, if you go online and look at their website, it reads like a primer on how to strip American democracy away and replace it with Christian nationalism, a theocracy that makes us far more akin to the church in Ghana built above the slave quarters than to anything we would recognize, indeed, much more akin to the women's fight in Iran against their government, where they are raped in police stations. Let's just remember something. Viktor Orban, who is the friend of all these people, a big fan of Tucker Carlson, who quotes him all the time and invites him over, has started to move his country towards an authoritarian model that Fox News, Tucker Carlson, the Republican Party, Donald Trump, all these others want to emulate here in America. And so sadly, and genuinely, it breaks my heart. When I was listening to you talking about your trip to Ghana, this is not past history. This is now. And it is going to repeat here in the United States unless we crush, and I choose that word advisedly, this snake in our midst of a combination of racism, white supremacy, which you pointed out so well in the segment before our little talk here, and the rise of Christian nationalism. This is all one and the same reactionary movement. These people are holding hands across the distance of history, which, as you rightly point out, is not so long ago, with the slave trade. They are rolling us back into an era where what was unthinkable even 20 or 30 years ago in America is now becoming thinkable. It is no coincidence that there's also a rise of anti-Semitism, that in Elon Musk, for instance, today, we have echoes of Henry Ford in 1920, who started an anti-Semitic newspaper railing against Jews. These things all go together. White nationalism, Christian nationalism, anti-Semitism. This is the world the Republican Trump cult has brought us. And every American who loves their country must stand up and fight these people with tooth and nail. It is a life and death struggle. This is not a moment for faltering.
Amen. You can get an amen, Frank Schaeffer. It is always a pleasure. Thank you. I really appreciate everything that you said. We'll be right back.
Thank you.